Okay, so
Sorry.
as Paula mentioned, I'm going to be talking about content orchestration. And this is really about tailoring content for different scenarios. And we're going to be talking about a pretty broad topic. Really, what I want to focus on is explaining what content orchestration is. It may be a term that you've heard before, but may not have a real clear sense about what it is. So I want to define it a bit, explain what the dimensions of content orchestration are, the different elements that you can use, how you implement it. So it's not just a concept, but it's something that we can actually utilize in our work. And it supports making decisions. So how do we make decisions in content orchestration? So that's an outline of what I'm going to be discussing over the next hour or so. I will be, as Paula mentioned, taking questions at the end. So as I go along, if you have questions that occur to you, please do put them in the chat. So just a really quick introduction for those of you who don't know me. My name is Michael Andrews. I'm a content architect and strategist. I've been doing this now for some years. A lot of my more recent expertise is around headless content management. And this gets into areas such as content modeling and modular content. And these are things that actually interact a lot with content orchestration. I've also written a couple of books on content metadata that you can find on Amazon, and I mentioned that because metadata is also very important to orchestration. And just as a side note, I am open, like a lot of people, as Paula mentioned, there's a networking sheet. I'm someone who's interested in new roles. So if I talk about anything that seems like it'd be something I can help your organization with, feel free to reach out to me. My LinkedIn details are there. And also check out my blog, Story Needle. I write about a lot of the topics that I'm going to be discussing today. One more thing, I will from time to time mention specific vendors. I'm really giving much more of a conceptual presentation, but I'll mention vendors just to give you a sense that yes, there are tools that can help you do some of the things I'm going to be talking about, but whenever I mention a vendor, it's not an endorsement there. I'm not going to give you any recommendations about specific tools to use, and I may not have always evaluated all these things that I might be mentioning. So just keep that in mind. I'm not going to be pushing any particular way to do this, just give you a sense of some of the options that are available. So let's start with what content orchestration is and what are the goals for it. And when I was preparing this talk, I really wanted to find a definition that's already out there, define that someone else has already defined this in a way that is a good definition. And we now have a lot of AI bots that are providing us answers instantly, and this is what Google gave back. And it really got this wrong because it's referring to orchestration as a centralized process where there's something there that is deciding everything on our behalf. And that's really the exact opposite of what orchestration is. It's actually a way of decentralizing decisions and empowering different teams to make decisions about how they want their content to be put together and delivered to people. So I have developed my own definition of content orchestration, and it's as follows. That content orchestration is the process for making decisions about how to assemble and deliver combinations of content that are tailored to the situation of users who would benefit from that content. So just to quickly unpack this, what it is content orchestration is about a way to make decisions about the content that we're providing to people. And this is about a couple of dimensions of it. One is how do we assemble different pieces of content together and where does that content go? like what channels or touch points does it go to? And we're doing this with the purpose of tailoring it for different kinds of users in different situations. So it's really getting at this idea of coordinating the user journey. We know that users are moving across time and are often moving across channels. So they're hopping from one channel to another at different points in time. And this graphic here, it comes from Adobe. They're trying to illustrate this idea of that coordination of the user journey. Um, they are emphasizing, 3 channels here, social being one of them. That's not really my focus, but whatever you're doing, you probably have, thinking about your users as not being restricted to one channel. So this really helps us a lot with thinking about the fact that people have a journey that is moving across different touch points at different times. And it's about customizing content for users. Now, customizing content for users is not a new concept. And we've been looking at this in various ways over the past decade or more. And you can really divide customization of content in 2 ways. One is where you customize snippets of content. And there's a range of ways we do that. There's personalization, where you're taking a bit of content and you're customizing it. There's optimization, where you're like trying to come up with variants of a couple of details there and figuring out which one works best. We have now this idea of zero-click search, where you're trying to get that instant answer, like we just saw with what is content orchestration? Well, that's a zero-click search we just saw. It doesn't necessarily work great all the time, but that's what people are toying with now. And then there are other ways of customizing content that are about the delivery. So deciding which items to give to people. So there are things like targeting and segmentation and recommendations. These are all about making choices about which items to show to people. These are all useful techniques, but they only go so far in and of themselves. So what orchestration does is it actually draws on some of the learnings of these different techniques and takes bits of all of them. And by doing so, it can give maybe a more granularly tailored bundle of content to people. So you are changing more details and you're thinking more about who to deliver this to. Really, we've seen an evolution in content customization over time. So at the start of sort of the history of the web, we started with what I call page substitution. So the easiest way to think about page substitution is if you were a business that sold to both consumers and to other businesses, you might have different parts of your website. One section's for your consumers, the other sections there for your business users. And you would basically steer someone to one part of the website or the other part of the website, depending upon who they were. So that's page substitution. You're just coming up with 2 different pages depending upon who the user is. Maybe 10 or more years ago, we started getting into changing parts of pages. So we got into what I call snippet or widget substitution. So this would be like you would change a little part of something depending upon where that person was coming from, for example. And a lot of personalization uses this technique. And it's potentially useful in some cases, but there's a limit to what you can do with that. But we're now kind of moving into a new era. It's just starting, but it's really about being able to change lots of different pieces of a web page or lots of different parts of a screen and tailoring it for the person who is getting that. And this is opening up a lot of possibilities for changing the content. So we're finally getting at this idea that's been around for a long time And Paula mentioned that one of the speakers, I guess in a couple months, is Kevin Nichols, someone I used to work with many years ago. And he was talking a long time ago about the right content for the right at the right time. And this is something that we've been trying to work towards for many, many years. And it's been very difficult to get to this. But we can use content orchestration to get the right content at the right time for people. And we do this three ways. One is we are using orchestration to define very specific context that we're trying to address here. And we're going to add some logic to how the content is delivered. And then we apply that logic to different content variations that we have available to deliver. So there are these three parts here that we utilize when we're orchestrating content. So let's look at this idea of context. And you probably talk a bit about context, making things contextually appropriate. So there are actually different dimensions to this. We have to think about the customer. And so we have to get the content to the right customer. We have potentially a lot of great content in an organization, but if we're sending it to the wrong customer, obviously we aren't being very successful. And that means we have to offer that customer the right content. So we have this need to match up the right customer with the right content. And this is about finding an agreement with the intent of the customer and the intent of the content. Now, this is where most people stop. They think about, okay, if we can match the content of the right content and the right customer, we're done. But there's actually another side to this triangle here, and that's the business. Because we need to think about what the business can do to satisfy the customer. They need to be ready to give the customer what they need. So we need to think about that relationship between the business and the customer. What is it that the customer is expecting of the business? What is the business is in a position to do for the customer? And also to think about what the business needs to be preparing in the way of different content variations. So they have different conditions that they're thinking about, things that they want to offer at different times. And we need to coordinate all three of these different elements, the customer, the content, and the business, and make sure that they're all in harmony when we do the orchestration. And this gets into a lot of variables. And the variables are deciding what it is that we deliver. So let's talk about these variables a bit. So first, let's look at the right content. What constitutes the right content? And this gets into things like what pieces of content to provide, what variants of content, even what versions of content. And that's all kind of very abstract, but we can start breaking it down into different dimensions of the content. And these are things that we specify in our metadata. These are things that are profiled in our content model. For those of you familiar with content models, we are defining with some specificity what this content's about. And we use that specificity to determine what the right content will be. So we have things like structural metadata. What is the editorial role and purpose of different elements of our content? Things like, is this an explanation or a call to action? Those kinds of things are structural metadata. Then we have our descriptive metadata. So things like, what is this content talking about? What themes is it talking about? Or topics or locations is it mentioning? These are all aspects that we consider in our orchestration. And then we also have a lot of things that are kind of background information that we need to know to deliver the right content, but they may not be things that are visible explicitly to the user. So these are what are called administrative metadata. So Who's this for? The audience. What's their knowledge level? When in their journey is it meant for? And then who created it? Why is it there? Who in the organization put it out there? What is the purpose, the business purpose of the content? That's things that we need to specify. Um, when was it created? That's going to have an influence on the right content as well. And finally, there's technical metadata, things like, is this a long piece of content or a short piece of content, the format of the content, things like that. All these are considerations when you are deciding what the right content is to deliver. The right time. So this gets into the readiness of the business and its priorities. That's going to influence when, how we orchestrate the content, when we give content to people. It can be things like the terms that are mentioned in the content, the availability of things. So just imagine that someone is looking for where can I get a prescription fulfilled right now? Well, if they need it right now, we need to start considering, well, what stores are open right now where someone can go and pick up this prescription. That kind of information gets factored into the orchestration. So we think about when something is available is very important. So these kinds of things are defined in what's called an enterprise architecture. They are managed by a lot of sort of data systems that big organizations have, but they're used in the orchestration. And then finally, we have this part about for the right person. We know that people are different, they have different needs, and we want to take what we can learn about them and factor that into our orchestration decision so that we try to give the right content to the right person. And there are a lot of factors involved here. Location's an obvious one. We have people listening to this who are in different countries even. So that's going to obviously impact what would be the right content for people in different countries. Sometimes it's things like their personal characteristics, things they own even. Now, for those of you who are familiar with something like personas, you've probably been told like, oh, you shouldn't be like putting that kind of detail in a persona. It's not really the right thing for a persona. Personas are really about usability, generally. This is orchestration. Sometimes these details actually matter a lot. So think about things they own. If I own a car, and you're selling insurance, they would be interested to know, do I own a car? Or do I own a house? Things of that nature. Do I have children who are going off to university now? Things of that nature really can influence what the right content is for the right person. In business to business content, their profession can matter. All these sorts of details can be very important. Now, where did these details come from? They come from a lot of different sources. And there's a sort of a hierarchy of data sources, everything from what's called zero-party data, where people have really volunteered information to a website, say, or a company to help them locate what it is that they want. And then all the way to third-party data where you're basically taking data from another source and making inferences from that about what someone might want. Now, this data, it varies a lot in its quality and its utility. I'm not going to get into a big debate about this, but most big organizations have this kind of data to some degree. And it sits in a tool like Salesforce or something like that, and it's utilized in content orchestration decisions. And it may be organized in what some people are calling an experience model. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later, what an experience model is. It's kind of a newer concept out there. But anyway, this can be useful in figuring out the right content for the right person. Now, it's useful because we're thinking about the customer context. And we want to know whatever we can figure out about the customer's context when we're thinking about what the right content will be for them. Now, some of the things will be a lot easier than other things. For example, when someone is looking for something is pretty easy for us to figure out. Where they are is also pretty easy for us to figure out. We can look at, say, their IP address, um, how they're coming to us. Maybe we can figure that out. We can figure out something about their pathway to reaching us. You know, did they click on an email we sent them? Did they come from a search? Things like that. Um, what they're interested in, we might be able to figure that out to some degree. Maybe we can look at some search terms that they've uh, used to come to us. Who they are, that might be a little harder for us to figure out. I mean, sometimes we know that. Sometimes these are people known to us. They might even be existing customers. They might be logged into our systems. Other times we're not really sure who these folks are. And then why? Why are they here? That's probably the hardest thing to figure out. Now, sometimes they're very explicit about why they're there. They've indicated to us why they're there, but other times we have to make some guesses about why they're there. But any of this information that we can get is going to be useful to us in orchestration because it helps us figure out the customer's intent. Now, I mentioned some of these things, but these are all useful things to know when trying to establish the customer's intent. What are their interests? You know, what have they expressed an interest in? How they've come to us? What have they done previously? That's going to give us a sense of where they've come from, what they've registered interest in, what they know already. Their prior knowledge is useful as well. Their relationship with us, especially if these are not new customers, but someone who has a relationship. Maybe they've subscribed to things we offer. They bought things from us. However, they have a relationship with us. And then the timing as well. So we know certain times of years is more likely people are going to be interested in certain things than other times of years. So these are all examples of kinds of signals of customer intent. So we've now looked at some of the kind of raw ingredients that we can use to think about orchestration, but how does orchestration actually happen? I mean, you don't just take this and put it in a mixing bowl and then give people exactly what they need. We need to have some processes in place to make orchestration uh, implementable so it can actually deliver things. So as I mentioned before, we have been going through this evolution where we started with this very simple technology here of basically steering someone from one page or another page. We started getting a little more sophisticated with changing some details on a web page, and now we are getting to the stage where we can change multiple details on a web page. And this is now moving us from the previous era of really static content, where none of the information changed when it was delivered, to really dynamic content. So orchestration provides truly dynamic content. We've talked about dynamic content for a number of years, and a lot of that, which I showed earlier, where you're swapping out snippets of content, that would have been called dynamic content 10 years ago. But the goal post has moved forward now. And really, truly dynamic content is when you're orchestrating a lot of the details. And that's being enabled by something called API federation. And this is really kind of a way, think about it as like knitting together different strands of content that are coming from different places. And I'll show you conceptually how this is happening in the background in a moment. The other thing about the evolution of the customization I'm talking about is that it's changing not just what is changing and how it's being done, but who's involved. So we've moved from this sort of pre-assembled content where your choice was between two pre-assembled pages, say, to this more adapted content where people would get details changed, and we were trying to nudge people in a certain direction by changing one specific detail. And now we're getting into this orchestrated content where we're composing uh, different bundles of content based on different scenarios. And this is involving both setting some rules that are allowing us to choose how to compose these bundles of content and run experiments. And it is much more of a team effort now. I think as content professionals get more involved with orchestration, I think they're going to find they're going to work a lot more with directly with business users and sort of setting up the conditions that allow people to experiment with different combinations of content to see really what works for users and what works best. One of the ways that we allow this is to develop what are called stacks. And a stack is just, technically it's thinking about having different layers of your ecosystem there that have different roles. So on the right side is sort of the traditional style where we had a single platform, a single content management system, which is basically managing all the details about what content was available and how it would be assembled and delivered. Now we're moving more towards a stack that supports orchestration. And what that means is that we have multiple sources of content we can draw on. We have this, what I mentioned is API layer. It's just a way of connecting different sources together. And then we can deliver it to many different uh, frameworks and front ends. So that means that our content can actually be available to all these different channels that people are moving across. And we can provide content to whichever channel they're at, and we can think about where they are, what they might need at that point in time. And we can manage this all through this one connected process here through the stack. I promise you this is going to be the most busy slide you'll be seeing today. And I apologize that it is a little bit busy, but some of you may be interested a little bit in what's happening behind the scenes. Now, I know some of us have been interested in, say, ecosystems and how we can kind of join up different areas of activity in organizations. And this is really sort of an ecosystem diagram. There's a concept that people are talking about now in connection with orchestration called composability. And really the way to think about this is that you're using many different systems and creating a system of systems. So let me try to explain this diagram a little bit, and hopefully it will give you a sense, a little bit of how this works. At the top here, on the left-hand side, we have a user, and the user is potentially interacting with different touch points. They may be interacting with more than one website that an organization has. An organization probably has even more than one app, and they may have other channels as well. So this person may be moving between these different touch points, and they need content available on whatever touch point that they're interacting with. In the center here, we have this API layer I mentioned. And then at the bottom, we have different sources of content and data. On the left side, we have different sources of content. We might have more than one content management system. We might have a DAM, which has, say, images and other videos and other kinds of media assets. There's something here called a PIM that's really there. It might have your product catalog in it. So these are all supplying content to these different touch points. We also, on the right side, we have some different data sources. So a bunch of acronyms here. I'm not going to explain them all, but some of them deal with customer information, things like that Salesforce system. Some of them are more sort of enterprise data systems, it's supplying information about, the hours of your stores and inventories and things like that. And we can connect all these things together. We have different things like taxonomies to coordinate these things, sometimes translation systems, search. But really, in the API layer, we're thinking about how these different sources need to be connected and knitted together to provide what the customer needs. And then as the customer is interacting with these different touch points, that's giving us back signals about what the customer wants, and then we are making decisions about what to give them next. So it's supposed to be kind of a virtuous cycle here where the customer is interacting, they're expressing their interest. We're going back and looking at what we have, making decisions about what would be best for them, giving it to them, and then seeing what they want next. All right, that sounds very technical, I know, but let me try to take this out of the technical context and maybe put it in a frame that some of you might be familiar with. So maybe some of you are familiar with service design, and with service design, there's a concept of service blueprinting. In the center here is a conceptual diagram of what service blueprinting is about. And essentially the idea of service blueprinting is that you have the customer interacting with our organization, and the customer's direct interaction with our organizations on what's called the front stage. So, it's our user interfaces that we offer them, or our customer representatives, those types of uh, you know, things that our customers are interacting with. But behind the scenes, those front stage elements have to have support from the backstage. So these are different processes that organizations have, different systems that they have. And this really aligns pretty well with how content orchestration works. So the front stage really is our customer user experience. The backstage is really where the orchestration's happening. So that's where our customer facing content and data is, and our internal data systems are on the backstage and are being tapped for the orchestration. Some of you may be wondering, so how does this relate to journey mapping? Journey mapping is obviously a long-established approach in user experience and in content strategy work. This is again, a conceptual representation of a journey mapping, but it starts off with a scenario. You kind of walk through how the user would ideally want to work through that scenario, the different steps that they would be taking, the different expectations they would have, what they would need to have available to them to satisfy those expectations, things like that. So that is really, really handy stuff. But journey mappings don't get into a lot of detail about specifying what content is needed to be orchestrated. So think about journey mapping and content orchestration as being complements to one another. The content orchestration deals with the supply side. So it is there to specify what to deliver to people. The journey mapping is the demand side. It's about determining what's expected by people. Now, they are complements, although they do deal with some different levels of detail. The content orchestration is really there to determine the relevant content. It gets very granular because we need to get very specific about what to give people. And it involves rules. The only way we can manage the complexity of figuring out what to give people is to come up with some specific rules. And we measure how successful we are with what we are delivering. And we use that as feedback to adjust what we deliver to people. Journey mapping is a little less granular. It's kind of about sequences, about the experience that people are having, the situation of use. I mean, so these are talking about somewhat different aspects here, but they do work together and they are a very good team. So we've talked now about some of the parameters that we consider in content orchestration, a bit about the kind of mechanics of how orchestration is happening, different systems that are involved and things like that. But how do we actually put this into practice? So think about orchestration as really about assembling an ideal page or screen for a user. And I'll give a example from myself here. So as a content strategist, I'm very interested in events relating to content strategy. I also live in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm interested in events happening in Washington, D.C. And these events can be about any number of things. So it's not at all restricted to content strategy. So I have two sets of interest here, and I consult different sources of information depending upon the interest I have. And because these different sources will maybe have different kinds of details in them. Now, suppose that there's an overlap between these interests, and I find that there's an event about content strategy that's happening in Washington, D.C. Well, it would be then possible to find two different sources discussing this same event and find that they have some different details that I would actually like to bring together in a single experience. So what I would be doing is after I've retrieved these different items from these different sources, I would want to be able to take the parts of each of the different sources, pull them together, and assemble them into a experience so that I could see what the next event about content strategy happening in Washington, D.C. would be. That conceptually is what's going on here. And again, I know it's a somewhat complicated looking graph, but diagram here, but the important point is that it's not a search. A search is just when you're getting a single match here, and then you have to go and decide whether or not that's an appropriate match for you. Here we're doing something a lot more sophisticated. We are doing several levels of evaluation before we give something to the user. And that, I think, is what empowers content orchestration to be much more powerful than, say, search is. Now, how does one do this? There are, fortunately, a growing number of tools out there that are helping with this process. Tools that actually make it easy for non-coders to do some of this orchestration decision-making. I know I've talked about APIs before. For a lot of us, it's like, I don't know what an API does. I mean, that's not something you deal with necessarily in your day-to-day work. But these new tools are allowing people who are not technical to set up criteria where they look at triggers, conditions, actions they want to happen. Um, the tools work in different ways. Some of them are based on something called GraphQL. It's something, if you are at all technically curious, it's a great thing to learn about. It's not a super hard thing to learn about. So if you have an inclination that way, it could be a worthwhile thing to know about. Other things work more like a logic tree where you have these sort of and or type branching statements. But however it's done, the tools are starting to emerge that let you play around with these different uh, variables and make up rules about how you want to make decisions. I mentioned before about information about customers and how that factors in. So getting to the right person. Um, there is a concept that's I've only recently seen being discussed called an experience data model. This is here's coming from Adobe. They seem to be using this term. I'm not sure if other people are using it yet or not, but um, this will at least give you a feel for how this works a little bit. So here we have an experience event. Think about it as you have an interaction that someone's having, with say something in a e-commerce site that they're looking at the price of something, the details of something, when where they're looking at it. Um, you can match it up with what we know about the person, and you start building up a sense of different situations that people would be in, and then you can use that and connect it with, all right, what content elements might I want to give them, or things like that. So this is it's kind of a little bit of a counterpart to the content model. To be honest, I don't think it's nearly as clear as a content model is. We get to really define the content model ourselves, how we want to uh, specify our content. I mean, you maybe don't have that degree of freedom with experience data models yet, but they are starting to really open this up and allowing you to specify specific things with an experience data model. So something to keep in mind and be aware of. All right. Now, the decision-making process. One of the challenges that people have had over the years with customizing content is being able to make good decisions. And we now have a lot more opportunities to change different variables with orchestration, but how do we make good decisions? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We talked about this earlier, that there's a range of difficulty with what we can know about a customer. Some things are easy for us to know, some things are harder for us to know. So we need to be clear about what we know versus what we are guessing about someone. And if we are overconfident and we're assuming too much, then we're going to probably not be successful. So important to keep that distinction in mind. Um, it's not wrong to make a guess about someone because you might be making a good educated guess and be right in more cases than not. And I'll explain in a moment, this is not just a one-shot thing where if we don't get it right the first time, we're never going to be able to recover from it. There are different ways we could approach this. So just bear this in mind that there are variants in how confident we are in the information we're working with. There are, levels of uncertainty here. So we sometimes have high certainty. We may know exactly who someone is, know exactly why they are there. We just need to give them exactly what they need. So in those situations, we really just need to specify what's required. But in cases where there's less certainty, we need to think about contingencies and what values we want to try to see which ones work best. So this gets into parameters, thinking about different kinds of parameters in orchestration. Sometimes we have required values, and we need to make sure that we're always supplying these required values. We know exactly who someone is, what they want. Just make sure you're giving them exactly what they need. And really, the goal there is to give them an exact match. We fail if we're not giving an exact match because there's no uncertainty there. So we should be able to do that. Where we have the uncertainty, when we're thinking about allowed values, which values would make sense? We can take some values off the table. We know they just wouldn't make sense at all. But which ones would make sense? And then think about which combinations we should present, and then we're aiming for a close match. We're not going to assume we're going to get it exactly, but we want to get close and see which ones the data shows that we are seems to be meeting their needs. So think about it this way. We have known unknowns. And when we know that we don't know certain things, we want to move from giving people sort of general information before we get too specific. So we have two sides to what we know and don't know. In some cases, the brand knows the customer, who the customer is. In some cases, the brand doesn't know who the customer is. We have cases where the customer is very clear on what they want. In some cases, the customer isn't clear on what they want. So these things interact together. Obviously, if the brand knows who the customer is and the customer knows what they want, that's simple. If the customer knows what they want, but the brand isn't clear who that customer is, then we need to think about how we can maybe pull the customer to where they need to be. Conversely, if we know who the customer is, but the customer isn't clear what they might need to know, and this sounds kind of funny, but think about a case like, oh, we're going to be, doing some system work on our product, and it's not going to be available. So the customer doesn't know that yet, but we know that that customer is a user of that product. So, in that case, we need to kind of, push something at them. And then, there are cases where there's a little ambiguity on both sides. So we need to do some push and pull there, not to overwhelm them at first, but see if we can give them something and give them some options and let them select what would be of interest to them. So that's sort of the dynamic here. I know it's a little conceptual, but the point is that it is not necessarily a one-shot thing. We have the opportunity to do this iteratively. So we've covered a lot here. As I said, it was a very kind of conceptual explanation of this. And really, it's pretty new to a lot of organizations. It's people have been playing around with personalization and other kinds of customization for a while, but this orchestration is something that's much broader and much newer. And really, as yet, there's no recipes or formulas for how to do this. I think people are just starting to experiment with it. And if you have that experimental mindset, I think you're going to probably get more out of it. So we have a lot of opportunities to draw on different inputs. I would encourage people to play around with different parameters. And don't expect that just changing one variable is going to make a huge difference here. We want to try to change several variables because I think that's been a limitation of personalization, is that people only would change one variable and they wouldn't necessarily get a big impact by doing that. But when we can start changing multiple variables, we can potentially uh, achieve a lot more impact. Um, so we can do some multivariate testing, but we obviously don't want to try to change too many things at once, or else it gets very hard to see what is making a difference there. And then really the value that content folks and anyone in a UX type of role can bring to this, I think, is that we are used to thinking about assumptions and questioning assumptions. And I think some of our business colleagues maybe just want to sort of jump in and just start throwing things against the wall and see what works, but we can really think about this in a more deliberate way. We have some knowledge about users and their motivations, and we can make educated choices about things to experiment with and probably move through this more quickly than if our colleagues were not drawing on our expertise. So I think there are going to be some great opportunities for us to get involved in this. As I said, it's a new area. A lot of uh, organizations don't even have anything set up yet um, to support this, but I can see this is going to be starting to get big over the next year or two. So hopefully you'll be getting an opportunity to get involved in it. I did find a few readings for people who want to learn more. Um, One article I wrote myself on my blog, it covers a few details that I didn't get a chance to cover today. The middle article there talks a bit more about some of the tools that are available if you are interested in researching that. And then final article is something that was just published in the last month. It's talking about the digital supply chain, but it does mention about orchestration a good bit. So that's another good resource. And with that, I'm going to open this up for questions.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Wow, that was, that was a lot. That was an incredible amount of information you just shared. And we've got some good questions that have come in. I'm gonna uh, ask Tony to queue those up for you. And if if you are still here, if you have asked a question, we may also start speaking to the questioners. We may also let you unmute so you can ask your questions directly. But Tony, do you want to kick off our Q&A
Yeah,
here?
absolutely. And thank you, Michael. Tons of fantastic information. So our first question was from Jim. And Jim, I'll go ahead and unmute you if you'd like to ask it live. But it was an early question, and I think you addressed it in one of the final slides in terms of diversity. How diverse is too diverse, and how do you know?
Yeah, I'm glad the question is being asked because I think you could potentially get overwhelmed by this. I mean, it's a very generic approach that we have here, so there are um, no pre and post constraints on the different parameters that you could feed into the orchestration process. I mean, you can be, drawing on all kinds of different data sources or different content parameters to do this. So you can easily get overwhelmed. I mean, I think realistically, you need to keep your experimental parameters to under half a dozen. Um, and play with that. Just select something and just based on what seems to make sense from either your business objectives or what the customer would be looking for. Why does something really matter to them? What's going to be the difference to them seeing one version versus another? So, there are going to be a lot of things that are going to be like, well, marginally it might be a little nicer for them to see something, but it's not necessarily going to change their behavior. And really what we're hoping for is to get some kind of feedback that shows that, okay, this was important enough that they were more likely to do something, the next step as a consequence of that. So, yeah, just trying to keep it a small subset, but you can switch out what you're looking at. If you're starting with something and you're not necessarily getting anything interesting, just switch it out and choose another, 4 or 5 or 6 elements and see if those are doing something more interesting.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you. Next question is actually from Paula. It was potentially for the group, but one potentially for you as well. What are the biggest challenges you've seen companies struggle with when attempting content orchestration?
Well, I think at this point it's pretty new, so I think there's a lot of confusion even about what it is. You will find people talking about it in different ways. Um, so there's no one definition of content orchestration, so that's a big hurdle to overcome. I think a lot of times when people are discussing it, they're talking about it a little bit more narrowly than I am talking about it. So, um, the assumption is that content orchestration exists only to support, say, marketing landing pages, something like that. And that's a perfectly legitimate um, use case for content orchestration, but that's much more narrow than I'm talking about. I mean, you could use content orchestration for uh, learning and training material, for example. That would actually be a very uh, good use case for it. And I'm not seeing people yet talking about those kinds of applications for it. Another thing I see is that people are looking at orchestration as a way simply to bridge a lot of these different systems. So if you think back, I showed that very busy slide showing all these different systems that exist in an organization. Well, the orchestration can help you kind of arbitrage these different systems and pull information from them and be able to do things. But um, it's not just a band-aid. It can help get rid of some of that friction that exists there. But really, I think the goal needs to be, how does this benefit customers? And sometimes people aren't really yet getting in that mindset. So I think that's another evolution in the maturity of this very, very immature concept. Obviously, we're just at the earliest stages of this.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. We had another question from Jim, a different one about accessibility screen readers and rebuilding pages. And I think, Jim, I see you're off mute. Would you like to ask that live?
Sure. Well, you just did. So thank you. But I know that with screen readers and other accessibility issues, if we rebuild the page, which I think is a very handy thing to be able to do, that there can be attention issues and there can be people who haven't realized that part of the page has been changed. And screen readers,
Right.
I have enormous issues with content changes.
Right. No, that's a great issue to raise. And full disclosure, I'm not an accessibility expert at all. So anything I say, do fact check me on this. But I mean, I think we are there are some. I mentioned this idea of frameworks and this idea of a stack, and so we have these sort of more modern frameworks now that have some accessibility hooks baked in them. And this is actually, I think, a benefit now is that we can use ever more modern front end systems with this sort of architecture because we can just change them pretty easily. And this can give us sort of the most up-to-date uh, accessibility option. So I think with what is it, the ARIA uh, the REO specifications can basically signal when something has changed, when content has changed, and people can start connecting that with these changes, because right now it's more and more the case that content is getting delivered through APIs, and so the age of static pages is really starting to fade away. So people are very aware that we have to have accessibility support. And so I think technically they are planning for this, but I can't speak in any more detail about that. But I'm definitely interested in it. So.
Thank you. Tons of great questions. If anyone has any others, please drop them in the chat. Angus, I see you're off mute, and I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tony. Yeah, so I was just going back to another talk that Michael gave quite recently about the idea of having a kind of an enterprise-wide content model that is that's independent of any specific CMS. And I'm just wondering if you can draw a line between that talk and the talk you gave today, Michael. So how beneficial or how important is it for an organization to, if you've got content in all these different CMSs that's being orchestrated into a single experience, how important is it for that content to be using some kind of shared schema or shared ways of structuring content, even if they are all coming from different CMSs?
Yeah, well, thank you for listening to my other talk there, and even thinking about the relationship between these two concepts. And they are different concepts that can interact with one another, but they don't need to interact with one another, I guess. So what we're seeing right now with the tools that exist to support orchestration is that they're kind of building a virtual model of the data that's coming from different sources. So what they do is and this is happening all behind the scenes. You as a user wouldn't necessarily need to see all this stuff, but they're kind of, there's a concept in metadata called crosswalks. I don't know if anyone's ever come across that before, but it's sort of like, okay, system A talks about something in one way and system B talks about it in another way, and they're sort of alike, but they're not alike, and how do they match up? And you do this crosswalk and try to get them where they well, that's essentially what some of these orchestration tools do, is they do kind of a crosswalk between different sources, and then they come up with sort of a third way to describe this stuff for the purpose of orchestration. And the person doing the orchestration is not even worrying about what it was originally called. They're just kind of in that virtual environment. So it's possible to do this without having an enterprise content model. And as I said, some people are kind of using this as a Band-Aid because they don't have a enterprise content model. If you did have an enterprise content model, which frankly, pretty much no one is there yet. But if you did, this would be that much easier to do. Because you wouldn't have to be doing that kind of crosswalking. It would be much more direct, and you would have more visibility, I think, even than you would otherwise.
Yeah. So I feel like for organizations that aren't there yet in terms of this kind of personalization, but maybe have dreams of doing it in sort of 5 years' time, the enterprise content model might actually be a good place to start to sort of prepare themselves to be better positioned to do content orchestration really well in the future.
I agree. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. You got to get started on this path of maturity.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
Sure.
Great. I think we have one more question from Kate. Kate, got the floor.
Thank you. I'll just unmute I am unmuted. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Paula and Tony, for hosting, and Michael, thanks so much for generously sharing your knowledge, and I'm just sucking it up as we can.
Thank you, Kate.
question. I typically work in regulated industries where getting anything published has a convoluted sign-off process. And typically lawyers and compliance people need to see what it will actually look like in the experience and track that. So how might one do that when you're assembling on the fly like this?
Right. Well, okay. I think it depends a lot on what it is you're trying to orchestrate. So think about it this way. A lot of orchestration is there to support defined scenarios. So you're saying, all right, if a customer is in this situation at this point in time, in this location, this is what we're going to provide to them. You've set up some rules that establish that. So those rules, once they're set up, are going to be consistently executed. So you can basically say, all right, in that situation, this is exactly what the customer is going to see. Is that okay for you, the compliance person or the lawyer? Let's take another situation. In this situation, this is what this customer will see. Is that okay? You know, and you work through those sorts of things, and you can obviously set up other rules. In no case will someone ever see this combination or something like that. So you can actually, you know, have the lawyers clear the rules and make sure that they're okay with the rules.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah, I can.
That's good. I mean, I hadn't really thought that one through until now, but I think this definitely is quite. It feels feasible to me that we can work with this. Yeah.
I think that means rather a bit more coordination and building in some time. But I suppose just a checkpoint. Once you've established the rules, that's one checkpoint, and then you've got the actual content that is being cleared, because the content, and I suppose you just do variants, don't you? Like,
absolutely. You do variants. You know, so I mean, so if you do, you know, so if you know, just I don't know, you know, I'll make up an example here, but if you have different content for different states in Australia, you know, and you know, and so you know, New South Wales is seeing one set of content, and you know, that sort of thing, and you know, it's just a rule. And so, you know, if someone indicates that their residence is in New South Wales, they see the New South Wales content. You know, it's that basic, really, and then you can start, you know, drilling down from there.
Thank you.
I think we had one more question, kind of a follow-up from Jim. And I think, Jim, you can come off mute if you like.
I'm going to follow up on what Kate said. I haven't had to do this for a while, but her question about getting legal to sign off on things just reminds me of past conversations about legal and stakeholders getting confused about content models. Because I've had past cases, not where the content's been this dynamic, but where there have been policy information, and in light of your example, a case where for a large software company that no one has ever heard of, they were showing different policies depending on where the employee was situated, and trying to make sure that if an employee was not entitled to this policy, that they never saw that policy, so they didn't make a decision based on that policy. Because that situation would have been a great test case for all of this stuff, because we had a confused challenge to make sure that they only saw the policies that they were supposed to see.
Right.
And so how, in those conversations, do you have suggestions? You know, I mean, keep raising the idea of variances. Here's our prototype, and then we vary depending on these cases. Are there other suggestions on how to talk to people about, here's a sea of content, employee A is going to see this stuff, employee B is going to see that stuff?
Yeah, I think My general suggestion would be to focus on the rules and then focus on the actual outputs that express the different variants that we're talking about, but not talk about the model itself, because that's just gets to be very abstract to someone. I mean, people just don't know what a content model is, and but they will kind of understand the rules. And I think there was the one slide there where I showed just how even some of the tools now are starting to get visual with showing and or something like that. It's these are similar to a lot of the kind of process diagrams or decision tree type diagrams that people are familiar with. So I think that's going to be something that people can relate to.
If I can just add one last comment, thank you for your taking these questions in we are hitting you with very hard test cases with this, and I appreciate your good cheer in responding to this.
Oh, my pleasure.
Well, and thanks for the great questions, Jim and Kate and Angus, and yeah, and of course, thank you, Michael, for your time tonight. I know you are staying up late to be here with us, so we appreciate that. And thanks everyone for joining us. We will notify on Slack and our website and LinkedIn and all of those places I mentioned earlier, and that we've been linking to in the chat when the recording is ready. And of course, we invite you to join us again next month for Rahel Bailey talking about content operation. With that, good night all.
Night.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.